All right, and we start recording. By the way, presumably everybody got the two take-home labs that I wanted you folks to do. I had somebody asking me questions on how to do them, and unfortunately for a couple of days, I was in a place with virtually no internet access. So if any of you have typed urgent emails, there's just been no way for me to see them. I'll sort everything out this afternoon. I'm hoping most of this was fairly self-explanatory. I think I owe you folks at least one Google spreadsheet, and I'll get that set up early this afternoon. So I do want to finish up about altruism, and I want to turn the steely-eyed gaze of evolution onto human behavior. But first, let's start with wasps. I want to do a case study of parasitic wasps, which seems oddly appropriate. One of the most surprisingly widespread strategies in the insect world are called parasitoids. Parasites, by definition, steal a benefit from a host. But parasites don't necessarily kill the host. I mean, sometimes it happens, but it's not necessary for a parasite to continue its life cycle. Parasitoids are similar to parasites, but they always kill the host that they're in. When I was a kid, my mom grew a lot of tomatoes in the backyard garden. You know, some of you might grow tomatoes yourself or have moms that do, so maybe you've seen this. And every so often, the tomatoes would start getting eaten by tomato hornworm caterpillars. You ever seen these guys? They are large and they're surprisingly hard to spot because they are perfectly colored the same color of a tomato leaf or stem. And they will strip your tomato of every leaf that it's got. There's a related species called the tobacco hornworm that does the same thing on tobacco plants. Anyway, I still remember this. One day I was out there when I was a kid, and I saw this tomato hornworm caterpillar, but it was moving slowly, and it looked like it had Q-tips sticking out of it. And that caterpillar had been hit by a parasitoid wasp that had laid its own eggs inside the caterpillar. And as the caterpillar grew and grew, it was a very hungry caterpillar. The wasp eggs hatched into larvae that started devouring the caterpillar from the inside. The wasp larvae ended up burrowing out of the caterpillar and spinning these cocoons, and that's what I was seeing. The caterpillar had these things that looked like the fuzzy ends of Q-tips sticking out of its body, and that was the wasp cocoons. The caterpillar was still alive, but clearly not doing very well and certain to die and never become a moth. And that happens all the time. That is not, there's an entire family of wasps that I think are all specialists in this lifestyle. And as far as I know, every insect that has ever been sufficiently studied has turned out to have a parasitoid species that lays its own eggs in the host insect's eggs or larvae, and the parasitoid larvae devour the host larva and eventually come bursting out, either killing it or certainly ensuring that it's going to die. So that's all over the place. That is a very common strategy. The biology of the xenomorph, you know, from the Alien franchise, right? Yes, remember? The guy gets a face hugger on his face, and then a little larva comes bursting out of his chest. That's actually standard operating procedure in the insect world. That happens all the time. And this is one of them. This is Copidosoma floridanum, caught in the act of laying its egg inside an embryo of a moth called Trichoplusia neat. Dr. DeSword knows more about Trichoplusia knee than I do. It's got an interesting behavior. It feeds on leaves that naturally produce a lot of latex. And that latex is thought to be an anti-predator deterrent because it will glue the mouths of caterpillars shut. But Trichoplusia will actually, Trichoplusia will actually go down and sever the latex vessels and then eat the leaf without having to deal with the latex, which is rather clever for a very small caterpillar. Anyway, Copodosoma floridanum is laying its egg inside this embryonic moth. And just as humans occasionally produce identical twins, because a fertilized egg sometimes divides into two halves that completely separate and each becomes two embryos. And just as armadillos always give birth to identical quadruplets, you guys know that? The egg divides and divides again, and then each of the four cells breaks off and give rise to a separate embryo. Yeah, armadillos always have identical quads. A single egg of Copodosoma can produce over 3,000 larvae. That's called polyembryony. And what's weirder is that the 3,000 embryos or larvae that all come from one fertilized egg are not identical. This is clearly a case, I'm not sure how it works, but this is clearly a case of phenotypic plasticity, because of the 3,000 embryos that are genetically identical, they'll develop into two radically different phenotypes. Down at the bottom is a reproductive larva, and this is the one that will actually crawl around, eat the caterpillar from the inside out, and ultimately develop into a new wasp. Up at the top is its identical twin brother, called a precocious larva. Precocious larvae don't ever develop into adults. Precocious larvae are doomed. But they grow these huge jaws, and they hunt down and kill the larvae of other parasitoids. They hunt down and kill all other parasitoid larvae that are not genetically identical to themselves. So yeah, you can have, if the same caterpillar happens to get eggs laid into it by two different wasps, the hunter-killer larvae of each will try to destroy all of the larvae of the other. So yeah, you have this desperate struggle going on inside the body of a caterpillar. Yes?
So does the reproductive larvae try to destroy or consume the precocious larvae of the same parent, or?
As far as I know, they don't. They don't have the jaws that you need to fight back. What the reproductive larvae would do is basically just eat the caterpillar. And it's common in such cases, I don't know how they know the trick, but they'll go for the less essential organs first. They'll actually go for the fat bodies before they go after the heart or the nervous system or anything like that. Yeah, they will keep their host alive as long as they can. So on the right, that's a precocious larva that's attacking reproductive larvae from an unrelated wasp mother. Those unrelated larvae have been stained green, and you can see the gut of the precocious larva is full of bright green. That's the flesh of the reproductive larvae that it's eating. This bright green crescent right there, that's its gut, packed full of the flesh of its enemies. Biology is just so metal sometimes. Now, here's the thing. At first glance, this looks like altruism because the precocious larvae will never become adults. They live and die in the host caterpillar, and they're never going to form cocoons. So they're dead. They are giving up any chance of ever having a future for the sake of those reproductive larvae. Or to put it another way that doesn't sound so anthropomorphic, you might think that any gene that converted a larva from being precocious into being reproductive would get passed on, because any larva that has that gene has a chance of becoming an adult, and any larva that doesn't never will. So why is selection favoring all of these larvae that will never reproduce at all? Well, it works because the larvae from the same parent are not just relatives, they're clones. Right? They are as genetically similar as identical twins would be, and their coefficient of relatedness is 1. So if there are genes that make some larvae become precocious, and one precocious larva dies, but 2 of its identical siblings get saved, then that gene is going to get passed on and increase in frequency in the next generation. Am I making sense there? So yeah, that is an extreme case of inclusive fitness, where the altruists are in fact genetically identical with the individuals they're giving up their lives for. And it's just another reminder that I was reading something recently where they talked about when people study genetics in high school and maybe in college, it tends to start with Mendel. Am I right? You don't necessarily have to write this down. I'm going to rant for just a couple of minutes before we go on. Right? We all started with Mendel, yes? And purple flower peas crossed with white flower peas, and you get heterozygotes, and here's the Punnett square, da, da, da. Yes, correct? It tends to promote an attitude that biology is destiny, and whatever your genes say you are is fundamentally what you are. That, a pea plant, cannot decide that even though it's homozygous for the purple pea color, it's going to identify as a white flowered pea. It tends to create this idea that what your phenotype is exactly what your genes program you to do. And there's a number of reasons why that is scientifically wrong. And one of them is the amazing things that phenotypic plasticity can do. And we've seen many examples of this in other species, but this is an extreme example, because if you just cut open a Trichoplusia caterpillar and found those in it, without looking, if you didn't already know, you almost certainly would not think they were the same species. But they're not just the same species, they're genetically identical. Those are identical twins. They just happen to look really, really different because of some phenotypic plasticity process that's going on. So, end of rant, but just something to remember is that Mendel basically got some things right, but we've added a lot to it. And one of the things that we know very well is that your genes are not your destiny. And that happens all the time in the living world. This is not just true for humans. It's all over the place. Okay. Last thing I want to get into before I start looking at human behavior is eusociality. Eusocial, okay, social, you know what that means. The prefix eu, EU, is Greek for good or real or true. So like a eukaryote, well, the karyo means a nut or a nucleus, and a eukaryote is an organism that has a true nucleus. Right? Yes? Okay. Eusocially organisms are truly social, and they live in colonies in which only one female member is reproductive, and she usually gets called the queen. Although the queen does not necessarily, the queen doesn't rule in anything that's comparable to the way that human queens rule, right? The queen does not wear big funny hats and drive around doing this, which is mostly what Queen Elizabeth seems to be doing these days. The queen simply is the only one that lays fertile eggs. And sometimes, the queen might be hugely swollen and do absolutely nothing but cranking out eggs constantly. All other members of the colony serve the colony and serve the queen, but they don't reproduce themselves. In a beehive, the workers will serve the queen because the queen is constantly pumping out this pheromone that makes them happy. In some termites, there is a single male. There's a king next to the queen. In honeybees, the queen in her young days goes off on one flight, mates with about 20-odd drones, and then comes back to the hive, and that is all the sperm she's ever going to need. It gets even better than that. The queen will fly up to a place called a drone congregation area, and a bunch of male honeybees, a bunch of drones, will try to catch her. And the first one that catches her puts his organ into her passage and ejaculates with such force that his organ breaks off and he goes falling off and crashes down to the ground like a Japanese Zero in the Marianas. And then a second drone will repeat the process, and when he ejaculates, his tallywhacker breaks off and is left sticking in the queen, and the rest of him just plummets to earth. He had one job and he's done it, and that's all she wrote. So the queen will come back with the severed reproductive organs of multiple males sticking out of her genital opening, and she'll go back into the hive, and she now has all of the sperm she'll ever need for a lifespan that ideally will be as long as 2 years. There's a point to this, by the way. Honeybees are weird, but this will make more sense when I talk about hypotheses for eusocial behavior. So there's a queen who does all the reproducing. There may be, in a honeybee hive, there are workers and there are drones who don't do anything but fly up to try to find another queen and mate with her. In termites, it depends on the species, but you'd have workers, but you might also have soldiers that specialize in defense. There's an Australian termite species where some of the soldiers specialize in squirting jets of acid from glands on their heads. They're not just soldiers, but they can be specialized in infantry or artillery. The organization can be quite complicated. The best known examples are insects in the classes Hymenoptera, which is ants, bees, and wasps, and the class Isoptera, which is the termites. There are a few others. There is one shrimp that I believe lives in sponges that is currently the only known marine eusocial organism. And there are 2 species of mammal that are eusocial. They're known as naked mole rats. This may actually be before your time now, but if anybody remembers the TV show Kim Possible, you guys watch that? Yeah. Anyway, she's got a naked mole rat as a pet. But that would be animal abuse if anybody did it in the real world, because naked mole rats have to live in colonies, and they can't survive for long outside of their home colonies. So I'm hoping that underneath the house, she's got like a queen and a whole colony of naked mole rats. I'm sure she does, they just didn't show that. Okay. How did this evolve? You might think that, let's say you have a queen bee and a bunch of workers. The workers do not normally reproduce. If it happens, you've got trouble in the hive and it's probably going to die out. But the workers, if everything is going normally, will never have offspring of their own, and they will work their entire lives until they literally drop dead and get thrown out of the hive by other workers to keep the hive going. They'll spend some time caring for young. They'll spend some time flying out to gather nectar and pollen. When they're not good for anything else, they will just stand at the entrance to the colony and beat their wings and serve the colony as living air conditioners. And then when they die, they just get tossed out, and more workers constantly are getting born. You might think that any mutation that gave a worker the ability to reproduce would actually get favored, right? How can it be that workers evidently have some sort of genetic basis for staying workers all of their lives and never reproducing? So why is that genetic basis there? Well, I'm going to start by giving you a very neat explanation that's probably wrong, and then go into one that's not really as cool, but is probably more likely to be right. And the really neat but wrong explanation is that hymenopterans have a sex determination method called haplodiploidy. An egg that has 2 of each chromosome develops into a female. An egg that has only 1 of each chromosome develops into a male. So when a honeybee is making eggs inside her body, she can choose whether to fertilize them or not. If she fertilizes them, they'll grow up to be workers. This is a worker right here on the right. If she doesn't fertilize them, they'll grow up to be drones. That's a drone. You can see they've got much, much bigger eyes. Drones have these great big bug eyes, probably because their only job is to find a queen from another hive and mate with her. And you need, good sense organs if you're going to hunt down a new queen who's ready to mate. Anyway, you can tell these apart very, very easily. So that's a queen. And by the way, she does not naturally have a pink spot on her. A lot of beekeepers will mark the queen with a small spot of non-toxic paint. So that's why she's got a spot right there. You can also tell she's a queen because her abdomen's bigger. But you can really tell she's a queen because all of the workers are in a circle surrounding her. They're doing that because she pumps out a very nice pheromone called Nasanov hormone. And when the workers get a hit of that, oh man, they love them some of that Nasanov stuff. They're basically junkies. Surrounding the queen, caring for her, fighting off enemies if necessary. And here's the thing about haplodiploidy. It sets up something odd. Assume for the moment that that queen has only mated with 1 drone. Well, all of the workers got half their DNA from mom and half their DNA from dad, right? Yes? Now, the workers, okay, the queen is producing eggs by meiosis, which means that for any given gene, there's a 50-50 chance that one worker shares it with the queen, and a 50-50 chance that the queen passed the same gene on to another worker, which means that any 2 workers share 25% on average of their genes through descent from the queen. Yes? Right? Everybody see that? Here's the catch. Those workers are diploid, so they've got a mom and a dad, but dad is haploid. Dad does not produce sperm by meiosis. He only has 1 set of all of his genes, and he passes the same set on to each one of his daughters because, that's the only way he can do it, right? Every cell in his body is haploid. Am I making sense there? So all of those workers got exactly the same set of their genes from dad because dad only has 1 set of genes to give. So any 2 workers share half their DNA because they got it from dad, plus an average of 25% of their DNA through descent from mom, which means that the workers share more genes with each other than they would with their own offspring.
They could have offspring.
What's that?
If they could have offspring.
If they could have offspring, yeah. If they could have offspring, they would share half their DNA with it, but they share 3/4 of their DNA with their own sisters. That matters because they're probably potentially sisters of the queen. When the old queen fails in a colony, as she sometimes does after 2 years of pumping out eggs, the workers will take one of their own sisters and raise her up to be the next queen. Instead of raising the queen larva in an ordinary honeycomb cell, they'll actually construct a queen cell, which looks, kind of like a peanut stuck onto the honeycomb. And they will give her extra portions of a special protein-rich food that they produce called royal jelly, and that will trigger her development into a fertile queen. Incidentally, if the old queen still isn't dead, but the old queen is not cranking out that sweet, sweet Nasanal pheromone, the new queen, the old queen may still be alive when the new queen is born. The first thing the new queen will do is find any other queen cells and sting the occupants to death. Right? Whichever one of those queen cells is the first one to hatch, that queen will kill all of the others. And then what usually will happen is the old queen will take about half the workers and leave the hive and go out to found a new colony. It's called swarming. If any of you have ever seen this, it's pretty cool. You'll have what looks like a big lump of bees hanging from a tree branch. Anybody ever had that happen? You ever seen a bee swarm? Yes? No? Don't bother me, I'm writing it down. Okay, it used to happen to me because we had a bee tree in our old neighborhood. And usually around about the end of classes, I'd come outside and there's this great big lump of bees hanging from one of the peach trees in the backyard. And they're actually pretty harmless at that stage. They're just looking for a new home. Anyway, what's that?
So could that be why colony collapses or is happening? Is because the old queen goes out to found a new colony.
Mm-hmm.
But if she's failing at reproducing, the colony will be able to sustain itself.
Well, I think once they find a home, I think the old queen is going to get replaced pretty soon. But yeah, she'll get them to a new home, and then if she dies, actually it has to be before she dies. They'll make some queen cells and create a new queen. And that new queen is going to have to fly out and go mate with some drones. And yeah, then the old queen will probably die. Okay, anyhow, the idea, by the way, I used to keep bees. I kind of know a bit about this from personal experience. I don't do it now, but it was fun. And folk medicine states that bee stings prevent arthritis. I don't know if that's true, but I should be good to go. Anyway, the idea is that here are these new queens being raised, and they're all should be sisters of the workers. And because workers are more closely related to their own sisters than they are to their own hypothetical offspring, the idea is that the workers are passing more of their genes on by raising sisters than they would by reproducing on their own. So if there is a gene that promotes this kind of eusociality, the number of copies of it is going to go up from one generation to the next because more copies of that gene will get passed on than genes that get passed on, between parent and offspring. The workers are passing on more of their genes by having a queen than they would be passing on by having offspring themselves. A couple of reasons why that's probably wrong. Termites are not haplodiploid. I think they've got your basic XY, XX sex determination scheme. Those termites are eusocial. The light-colored ones are workers, and then the soldiers have darker brown bodies, and if you look carefully, you can see they've got big black jaws. That black means very thick cuticle. Those are hard, those can bite. Compared to the workers, which are a lot softer and a bit smaller and lighter. They're not haplodiploid. Mole rats are not haplodiploid. Gall aphids are not haplodiploid. Synalpheus snapping shrimp, the only marine case of haplodiploidy we know, or marine eusociality we know, is not haplodiploid, and neither is the Australian eucalyptus weevil. So clearly you can have eusociality evolving in taxa that don't have haplodiploidy going on at all. The vast majority of ant, bee, and wasp species are haplodiploid, but they aren't eusocial. There's only a fairly small minority of haplodiploids that have ever adopted eusociality. And there's a lot of non-haplodiploids that have. And all that argument from relatedness only works if the queen has mated with only one single male. In fact, when the queen goes off on her nuptial flight, she can come back with the tallywhackers of as many as 20 males still stuck in her genital opening. Beekeepers call that mating sign, which means that worker bees are not necessarily all full sisters. They can have different fathers. Two workers with different fathers will only share 25% of their genes. Sometimes it's even less than that because you can transfer workers from one hive to another, and usually there's no conflict. With termites, I don't think you can, but with honeybees, it's actually pretty common to take workers from a hive that's strong and move them into a hive that's weaker, and usually nobody notices. And beekeepers do this all the time. That's a queen, and you can order queens from mail order queen breeders. There are people that do that. If you're a beekeeper and one of your hives has a failing queen, you can remove the old queen and put in a new one. You have to put her into a wire cage at first, because at first the workers will try to kill her because she's not familiar. But all she has to do is stay in that wire cage and just start pumping out that sweet, sweet Nasanov hormone. And after a couple of days, the workers will accept her. That white thing that you see over at the left side of the queen cage is actually some sugar, sugar fondant candy. And once the workers are cool with this new queen, they will chew through that fondant candy and release the queen. And she will be their queen, even though she might be not genetically close to any of them at all. And again, workers sometimes will stray into colonies where they're not related to any bee, and they'll generally do fine. Beekeepers can transfer workers from one colony to another to shore up a hive that's starting to fail. So this neat explanation for eusociality is probably wrong. It's probably not inclusive fitness. We do know that all known eusocials do share a common lifestyle, whether they are honeybees or naked mole rats. That's what a real naked mole rat looks like. They're not quite as cute as the ones on Kim Possible, if memory serves. Right. They live in very close quarters. They've got very rich resources, like all of the nectar and all of the pollen in honeybee colonies. And those rich resources that are shared require active defense. Kin selection might have something to do with it, because members of a typical eusocial species usually are related to each other. That thing I mentioned where you can swap queens and workers around is something that beekeepers can do, but it's not clear how often that would happen in nature. And there may also be something going on that's a bit controversial called group selection, which is selection on the level of colonies. Now, if you think about it, there's a sense in which you're not exactly eusocial, but the vast majority of cells in your body are going to die in your body without ever doing anything other than contributing to the overall survival of your body. Right? Only a very small number of your cells have any chance of ever giving rise to a new organism. Only your eggs or your sperm, and even if you end up having lots of babies, that's only a small fraction of the total number of eggs and sperm that you have. So virtually all of your cells are going to die, leaving no offspring, either during your life or at the very latest when you yourself finally die. Right? Only a very small fraction of your eggs or sperm have any chance of ever reaching genetic immortality. The problem is that when one of your cells doesn't get the message and says, hey, one of your cells says, hey, I'm no longer going to sacrifice myself for the good of the body. I want to start making more copies of me. Unfortunately, we call that cancer. Right? Yes? So there's a sense in which you can look at a human body as a collection of cells. But selection does not really act for very long at the level of individual cells. I mean, it sort of does, because like one of your body cells that undergoes a mutation that makes it start dividing rapidly is going to leave more copies of itself than other cells that don't have that mutation, right? But what I've just described is cancer, and the entire body will soon die. So the main level of organization at which selection goes on, in this sense, is on the level of bodies. Yes? You can get some selection-like things happening on the level of individual cells in the immune system, like the clonal selection that takes place in your immune system. You can temporarily get selection between competing lines of other types of cells. That's cancer, and it doesn't last very long. But most of what's being selected at the level of you or of typical animals and plants is selection on a body, not an individual cell. You could take that one notch up and talk about selection acting on the level of colonies. Right? A single honeybee is dumb as a fence post. When they get together, the whole colony can act in a concerted way and can build things that are orderly, like honeycombs that are hexagonal and spaced very precisely. Honeybees can learn. We know about the dance language of honeybees. Honeybee colonies can retain information. And speaking as a beekeeper, honeybee colonies have moods. There are some days when they are perfectly fine with you opening them up to check them out. There are some days when they're totally pissy. So here, what may be important is not so much selection on the level of individual honeybees, it's selection on the level of colonies. That instead of talking about individual bees having offspring, we ought to think about colonies giving rise to new colonies. And some types of colony are likelier to give rise to new colonies than others are. So maybe what we've got going on here is selection on the colony level, not the individual level, just as most of what we have going on in most animals is selection on the individual level, not the cellular level. Yes?
Would it be more accurate to say that selection is done on the level of the genome instead of the body? And that's what it carries over into the be examples since they share much of the same gene.
Well, I mean, if you dig Dawkins, then all selection is fundamentally on the level of the gene, because what it causes is changes in allele frequencies. This actually gets into a very long philosophical argument between Dawkins and before he died, Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book called The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, which put forth a model of how evolution could happen on multiple hierarchical levels, sometimes mostly on one, sometimes mostly on another. I would refer you to read that, but the book is about that thick. So, yeah, I actually did do a symposium where we read the whole thing once, and I don't know that I care to repeat it. Great man did not know when to shut up. What's that?
I said I have other readings to do, so
Okay.
I don't know if I want to add that many pages too.
Okay, well, a book that thick would actually make a very good defensive weapon if necessary. Okay, right. Does any of this apply to humanity? How about we take a break and answer that after the break? I don't have my phone on me. Hopefully I'll get it returned today, but it is not currently in my possession. So somebody tell me what time it is. 10:02. Okay. Let's reconvene at 10:15 and move on. This is a pretty good place to take a break and come back. So I will stop the recording.